our research with fellow scholars at the university and people that also work here. So we are very grateful for the invitation, and thank you so very much. So yes, our paper is Power to the Powerless, Adopting District Reform in Detroit. This paper started out kind of at the grassroots level of Brady's office, where we were discussing possibilities for a paper topic. And the recent passage of Proposal D to change from an at-large system to district representation was particularly interesting. In theory, the shift to district representation represents a new power dynamic in the city. And we were kind of excited by this notion. The literature does state that district-level representation would meet the demographic needs of the city a little bit better, and essentially, given the demographics of the city, would empower them. And we thought that this was a very kind of exciting notion, but also it was a little bit perplexing in that why are the voters, why are they going to try to empower the people in these contemporary conditions? We've got bankruptcy, there is high crime, there's population loss, there's all sorts of problems that are happening in the city. So why are there going to be structural changes that try to empower, so to speak, the powerless? But as things often go, that was our intention to move forward with the paper, and actually the literature took us in a little bit of a different direction. So instead of focusing so much on the implications of the district change for the people, we ended up looking a lot more at the adoption of district representation in Detroit. So we looked a lot more at the process of how did the proposal initially get passed. And moving forward, we're still somewhat concerned about whether or not the neighborhoods have gained primacy in Detroit's policy again. The interest in Detroit's have never really reflected the neighborhoods. The city politics have long reflected downtown and peak interests like corporations and labor unions at the expense of neighborhoods and community-based interests. So hopefully in the future we will be able to investigate more the first part of that question. And this is still a little bit of a work in progress, so we are very open to suggestions and comments, and if you can provide those at the end, that would be awesome. So structural change and representation. Just to get the terminology kind of coherent here, in terms of governmental structure, we're referring specifically to the system of representation that local governments use in their quest to provide services to their citizens. Now, theoretically, this can be anything from a direct democracy, like a New England town hall meeting or a Swiss village, or it can be an unelected technocratic manager, such that we are living under right now with the emergency financial manager in the city. As creatures of their respective states, cities do not have the autonomy to decide their structures of governments off the bat. They need to be granted home rule. And once the city is granted home rule, they are able to select from a menu of structural options that are available for representation within a city. And there are a lot of variants, but the two major ones are a representation structure that would be run at large, where your members of city council are elected from the community at large, and you win a seat by winning the highest percentage of votes. The other one is a district system, where the city will be broken up into different districts, and their representatives need to live in that district, come from that district, and theoretically it should have more of a focus on neighborhoods and really at providing for the needs of individual aspects of the community, as opposed to the at-large system tends to favor policies that look and approach the city as a whole and at large. In Detroit, the structure of representation via the city council has been remarkably stable. It has been in place for nearly 100 years. The city has had a council-mayor form of government with a relatively small 9-member council elected at large. So after about 100 years of stability with this representative structure, the voters decided to change it over. And one thing that was of particular interest is that the critiques that were being made of a district system back when they were being reformed at the turn of the last century were very similar to the critiques that were being made of the at-large system that is here today, that the system can be prone to corruption, that the system would be inefficient, or the system is not meeting the needs of the government. So very interesting that after about 100 years, you can flesh out that some of the criticisms are consistent with both of them. It is important to note that with a few major exceptions, most structural changes occur at the ballot box. This is not something that you often look to your state legislatures to accomplish, and it's not often done by constitutional fiat. But at the end of the day, it's a bit much to ascribe all, or perhaps even a not insignificant portion of Detroit's problems to its structure of representation on the city council. But there were some that do believe that structures and institutions matter. And in 2008, there was a group of citizens that was able to take those ideas and actually have them come to fruition. And the group of citizens was successful in getting a charter amendment passed that changed our structure of representation from an exclusively at-large system to a hybrid district system, where we will switch from completely electing members 9 at-large to hybrid districts where 7 would be coming from the districts and 2 would be elected at-large. So one of our research questions is, what is now different? What is it about the contemporary times? What is it about the context that's happening as we speak that made the conditions somewhat ripe for passage? Because Detroit does have a history of trying to attempt to make some structural changes. This is not the first time that there has been an attempt on behalf of the people to change some of the structures of the city. And oftentimes the vehicle for this change is through a formal process of charter revision. So in the 1970s, in 1971, or well, rather in 1970, 3 years after the Detroit race riots, there was a population that was very eager to hold government more accountable. And one of the things that came out of that was a proposal to elect a charter revision commission in 1970. And the job of this commission was to fix some of the aspects of the charter that were not representing the people properly, that were not providing for the accountability that the people were looking for. The Charter Revision Commission was elected in 1970, and when they came into office, they understood that because of the experience of the 60s, and because they were trying to move forward with the will of the people, that they were rather sensitive to the needs of the people and really wanted to understand and kind of gauge how the public felt about this. So over the course of the next year, they held several meetings, town forums, public meetings, and they really tried to access the variety of swaths of citizens that are in the city to really gauge their opinion about charter reform and structural reform. And what came out of that is that they realized that there were some contentious issues, that all structural reforms are not created equal. And for that reason, they decided to break up the proposals. So there was Proposal H, which was a large package of reforms. And then there was Proposal I, which was a proposal to move to at-large districts. And then there was Proposal J, to switch from a nonpartisan system to moving to a partisan system. Now, in the end, all of them lost. There was a proposal, of course, to go through to change the charter in '72. But in the '72 election, the broad package of charter revisions did not pass. And it actually lost by around 10,000 votes in an election where 375,000 votes were passed. So that one was a little bit closer. But the other two, the ones that dealt with structural reform, dealing with partisanship and dealing with the structures of representation, lost by significantly larger margins. And when you look at the analysis, race is one of the factors that can explain why there was such a strong split. Voting was largely done on racial lines, and if you look at the results, you can see at the district level that predominantly black parts of the community supported a move to districts when predominantly white parts of the city proposed to retain the at-large structure. In 1973, the charter revision got another chance to go before the public, and their broad package of revisions did in fact go through, but again, they did not even choose to run the move to district representation because they knew that it was rather controversial. In 73 was also the election that ushered in Coleman Young. So when he came in, he was coming on the heels of a lot of changes that had taken place within the charter of the city. And I thought that was kind of cool too, that you've got a real young Carl Levin there. I had not known that that's what he had looked like when he was younger. So again, you can fast forward to the 1990s, and again, there were attempts to change aspects of the charter. And again, the Charter Revision Commission decided for whatever reason that they needed to separate out the aspect that was going to change the city from at-large representation to district representation. So there were two ballot proposals that were put forward in the 1990s, one of which, again, was a large package of reforms, one of which dealt specifically with cutting down the language of the charter from several 100,000 words to still quite a number of words, but they did chop it down. And so they offered 69 revisions that way, and they offered one for the structural change. This time around was not like the 70s. There was not necessarily a populist mandate, so they were not as sensitive to the needs of the public in terms of gauging how they felt about the issue. There were no public forums held. There was not a lot of activity to really get public opinion, and it made researching kind of the aspects of that a little bit more difficult because you had to dig a little bit deeper to find out. All but one city council member opposed the change to structural representation, or change to district representation, and the reason is probably quite clear, which is they wanted to protect their own job. If you end up going from an at-large to a district system, the city will need to be divided into districts, and then there is the potential is there for a sitting council member at an at-large system to lose their job. So there absolutely was some resistance in the 1990s. So then fast forward to 2009, as it says in the flyer, and as you may know, the ballot initiative did pass, or the charter amendment rather, did pass. But getting there was actually not as easy as many would think. In early 2009, referendum supporters submitted approximately 30,000 signatures, which was enough to meet the 28,000 signature threshold to be placed on the ballot. On August 25th, the Detroit Election Commission voted 2-1 in favor of placing Proposal D on the November ballot. So it had the support that way, it had the people, and it had the Detroit Election Commission. But on Monday, August 26th, the Attorney General's office wrote in a letter that the petition language was not clear enough to go onto the ballot, that there were some technical components that were not being met, and for it to meet the threshold of what would be required to have a reform amendment, that they needed to change up some of their language. Then, after they had done that, they were under the assumption that the ballot proposal would go through. Charter amendment would go through, it would appear on the ballot. But a few days, a few weeks after August 26th, around September 20th, a Wayne County Circuit Court Judge Virgil Smith ruled not to place the measure on the ballot. And in the end, by September 22nd, the Michigan Court of Appeals ordered Proposal D be placed on the November 3rd, 2009 ballot. So it was a hard-fought battle. And again, maybe even more so in this case than in the 90s, you did have a lot of institutional resistance from sitting council members because they were trying to protect their job. And as we can see now, when the districts did go forward, 4 council members did in fact lose their jobs. So they may have been at least justified in their own workings to kind of save their job. So one other research question that really kind of drove this paper is, why did the ballot proposal pass so easily? because not only did it make it onto the agenda, but we found out that it ended up passing by a 3-to-1 margin, which was a little bit counterintuitive for us because we figured that there would be some contention, especially given the situation in the 70s and the 90s, where the public had even seen or stated that structural changes to representation are rather kind of hot-button issues. But it overwhelmingly passed with the support of the people. Now, the conventional wisdom, or at least the narrative that was kind of put out by Crane's Business Detroit and some of the other media outlets in the community, had said that, you know, there was a group of technologically savvy hipsters and 30 and 40-something professionals that are running around the city, very excited about Detroit, very excited about empowering the districts and really kind of having a renaissance here, and that their excitement and their usage of the new medias was enabled them to access parts of the electorate that had not been accessed before, that they were able to reach larger swaths within the community. And also that they had some fundraising that was going on. They had a pretty well run campaign where they were raising funds at notorious hipster kind of locations like PJ's Loggers House, City Bird, and Slow's Barbecue. So this absolutely kind of constitutes the conventional wisdom. The reason that it passed so easily was due to the hipsters, the hipster hypothesis, so to speak. But when you look at the election results tell a much different story. The election results actually say that you know, the conventional media may have overstated the effect of campaigns, and they may have overstated the effects of elections, because what we found is the results came out that it was never in doubt. Proposal D passed with 72% of the vote in favor of moving to district representation. And that's a mandate, that's a substantial block in support of it. But the turnout was only 23% of registered voters. So the social media campaigns, and if they were accessing larger swaths, then they must have come out in very low numbers because the turnout was not there. And also, not only was the turnout not high, but there was significant ballot roll-off for that particular ballot question of changing from at-large to a district system, meaning that people just chose to skip that question. And around 13,000 voters chose to skip that question. And so, again, it kind of shows that maybe it had less to do with the campaign. And finally, when you disaggregate the results...
What else was on the ballot?
What else?
You remember what else was on the ballot?
In 2000.
Yeah. The mayor.
Oh, that's right, yeah. So there was a mayor's race as well. And there was...
That's where the roll-off was from the mayoral election.
And when you disaggregate the results, it demonstrates the remarkable degree to which voters supported the proposition. Out of 529 geographic precincts, 3 of them had less than 50% support. In other words, less than 0.5% of the precincts, representing a total of 190 votes out of 117,000 votes cast, were against it. So it had overwhelming support, and it really did not have a problem winning once it was able to actually make it onto the agenda, which to us kind of led to one conclusion, that the heavy lifting in this process may actually be at the agenda setting stage. That once you can get it onto the agenda, then it will not require necessarily as much work. But that was... So our analysis, we wanted to dive into this deeper and kind of look at reasons for structural reform. We arrive at our findings by examining the historic and academic literature to identify factors that led cities to adopt structural change. From this analysis, we examine the case of Detroit, evaluating several hypotheses in the light of the experiences of the city from 1918 to 2008. And the reason for that timeline is because that is the timeline of stability of the at-large structure. So essentially, when we boiled it down and found some of these key indicators that would provide evidence for structural reform, we found that there was a perfect storm almost that had aligned within the city at the historical times that really allowed the forces to come together and provide for an environment that would be amiable to passing reform. Now, our list was not necessarily exhaustive. We did try to cover a wide range of indicators, but some things we didn't address were things like geography. We did cover about seven or eight different indicators, and I will not go over all of those indicators now, but I will go over the handful that are up there in terms of the media, external forces, demographic factors, partisanship, and focusing effects. So the media primarily in the form of the metropolitan daily papers has always played a leading role in campaigns for structural reforms. In most cases, the newspapers have supported so-called good governments, that is the progressives, reforms that are consistent with the preference of civic elite. This is likely not surprising to a lot of people, as the owners of papers were members of the elite themselves and had significant business connections. And the media oftentimes serves as a mouthpiece for kind of disseminating information about those interests. So it is very important to make sure that you have the support of the metropolitan newspapers and the media outlets in general if you want to have conditions favorable to structural reform. In the past, in the 70s, both papers came out against reform. In the 90s, both papers were for it, but other factors had not aligned. And by the time of this last election, both major metropolitan papers were in favor of structural reform and had come out saying that they would support a vote to change the structure. One thing that we looked at as well is kind of some external explanations for why this happened. Maybe it didn't have to do with factors that were happening in the city so much as stuff that was happening around the city, around the state, and across the nation. And transcending boundaries of the city, structural change in many senses may be inevitable. The external forces hypothesis predicts that Detroit would have moved to districts because district representation has become the latest best practice of governmental structures, and that a movement like this was almost inevitable. If you look at the top 50 cities in terms of population within the United States, only 3 have retained exclusively at-large systems, and that's excluding Detroit. Change has been relatively rapid. Austin, Texas was the latest to jetson at-large in favor of districts. And using this lens, we can kind of say that it was inevitable because cities are getting away from the governments that were created out of the progressive era. Now, well, I don't know what happened to the chart, but
That's why you don't use a pie chart.
demographics. If you look at race, yes, okay, so in terms of race, minorities overwhelmingly tend to support district-style representative structures because it will meet, it generally meets their needs geographically a little bit more. And as a result, it's not uncommon to see more support, and you would predict more support for a change to districts in a minority city. Now, if you look at the 1970s example, the city had not been quite as homogenized on some of the demographic aspects that it is now. The city had looked a little bit different in terms of race and class. But in 2008, the city was very homogeneous on the racial demographic of characteristics that would predict support. So we have an overwhelmingly African American population, and that in and of itself lends itself to support of moving to districts. If you look at class, A similar analysis can be applied where folks with money and more upper class interests tend to favor an at-large system, where middle class, working class folks and the poor tend to favor a district-style representation. And if you look at the class structures of the city, it is an overwhelmingly blue-collar city, working class city that is, and poor, that is evident by the fact that the median household value and income of the city is nearly half that of the state of Michigan. So again, on that demographic factor, it would predict support because we've got a very our class here is very geared towards what would be supportive of moving to districts. And on the partisanship question, again, Democrats would support or tend to support district styles of representation, where Republicans would support at-large representation. Now, theoretically, our city should not be partisan because we have a nonpartisan system in place, and that should prevent kind of partisan politics. But if you live in the city and know how things work, that is clearly not the case. In 2012 elections, 75% of the voters in the city cast straight party Democratic ballots, and the city consistently gives Democratic candidates 90% of its votes. So if you look on all of these factors, on these demographic factors, it does predict support for passage to district-style representation. Okay, and the last one that we looked at, or we're going to talk about now, is the idea of focusing effects, and how sometimes there can be events that take place that highlight particular problems that are happening, that bring to the public kind of a new awareness. And there were certainly some focusing events that made conditions ripe for structural change in Detroit when the proposal was put forward. And in September 2008, Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick resigned as a result of his conviction on charges that could be best described as corruption. And it also, the corruption, it didn't stop at the mayor's office. The corruption and the criminal enterprises also affected city council, and you had Monica Conyers plead guilty to bribery charges in mid-2009. And to both inside and outside observers, the issue of corruption in city government certainly meets the threshold for a focusing event, which would again indicate a favorable condition for structural change. And even aside from the corruption, there's a picture of Kevin Orr, the emergency financial manager. So kind of being the example that a lot of the country is looking at now in terms of municipal bankruptcies and the plight of the urban city, that as well could feed into the idea that there was maybe some focusing effects that made it so that the public thought this was a great time to take advantage of that and move forward with some structural change. So looking towards kind of the future, we really do want to focus a little bit more on our future research on the first half of the question, which was, did this change in structural representation to a district style, did that in fact empower the powerless? Did it in fact follow through with what the theory said should kind of come about when you have that structure in place? And in some senses, the answer is yes. The city structure of representation now aligns better with the city's demographics and ideological realities. So there are some aspects of hope in that way. But on the other hand, it's a bit of an overstatement to suggest that the adoption of a new style of representation somehow represents a reordering of Detroit's power structure, particularly in favor of the neighborhoods. And part of that could be because of low voter turnout. But perhaps in the final analysis, it's that the city is one of the last to finally emerge from a path that was defined by the progressive era. And if anything, the final question that we kind of were left asking ourselves is, what took Detroit so long?
Lots of time for questions and comments.
Yes.
I have two questions. The first is, I'm not a political scientist, so bear with me, but I was wondering why it was at one time considered the good government thing to do to have an at-large system of representation, and then later it was not considered to be, the district system was considered to be better. And then the other question was, could you speak a little bit about, you said minorities tend to support a district system, and I was wondering how that plays out. Do you mean any minority? Do you mean, you know, in a city that's majority African American, do they count as a minority in that kind of a situation, or is it the actual people who are in a minority in the city who are more likely to support it? You know, so those are my two questions. Thanks.
To your first question, our analysis did get into some of that. One of the other indicators that we looked at, which did not actually prove to be as much of an indicator as the rest of them, was this idea of progressivism. And were there shifts in what it means to be a progressive, or what the best practices, so to speak, are of progressivism? And I don't think our analysis was too conclusive if there was a progressive shift or.
Well, the term progressive at the local level has changed its meaning pretty dramatically. And around the end of the 18th or end of the 19th century, early 1900s, progressivism was a national ideology that looked at the role of government in everyday life, and at the local level, it meant something a little bit different than it did at the national. At the local level, it meant that there should be reforms in place where government is operated as a business. Okay, that you should have a financial management type perspective to government. And the practical sort of implementation of that was that government should be led by technocrats. Government should be led by people who have the city's best interests at heart. And prior to that, they had district level representation. They had strong mayor systems. The district level representation was viewed to be as a pretty significant source of corruption, primarily because immigrants were successful at capturing their districts, and then the old term was public versus private regarding. District representation was private regarding, where people who had an interest in a self-interest in getting rich ran for election and won. Whereas the public regarding, the city fathers, for lack of a better term, had the best interest of the city at heart. So that's where it started, the progressive movement. Today, it doesn't mean the same thing, because when we talk about good government, we're talking more about representation. And that is so that it's come back to the district level representation. As, I mean, we wouldn't call it progressive anymore, because progressive has so many different meanings. So that's the first part. And then the second part is, it's a very good question. What do you mean by minority? Political scientists have spent a lot of time looking at at-large versus districts. In the South, at-large representation was a way to keep African Americans off the city councils. Because if you had district level representation and you had geographic segregation, you would have a certain number who would actually be, by definition, elected to city councils. Up here, it's always had a different meaning, because in a predominantly black city that is electing at large, what does it mean to be a minority? And it's a little less clear on that. Now, in Detroit, up until recently, there were always one or two seats that were held by whites post-1972, because whites vote so monolithically as a block citywide. And so even though they were sprinkled in various places, they would all vote for the white candidate. And so Mary Ann Mahaffey was the other one for many years. This is before my time. And so it's a little bit different dynamic here, what it means to be minority. And so the answer to your question is there isn't a real answer. But if you look at the demographics nationally, the African Americans, poor, working class individuals tend to support district level representation for very complicated reasons. And so it's a little bit of demographics, it's a little bit of where you are in the minority majority of the political subdivision.
I guess my question is, you said in, I guess, near your conclusion, that the movement to district representation has been somewhat successful or has worked. And I don't know how long it's been actually in effect, and I wonder how you could make that statement when it hasn't been around that long, and in terms of, if we still have two at-large districts, what does district representation actually mean? It seems to me like it's kind of a peculiar mix of trying to keep two power systems together.
I guess maybe I overstated the impact that it's having as of right now, but by changing to a district system, that does inherently geographically meet the needs of the constituencies a little bit more. Whether or not that pairing of the neighborhoods and the districts now being better represented is actually going to provide for more political concessions or for a better government structure for those people is yet to be determined.
And it has changed, but it has had an impact on the dynamics of campaigns within the city already.
It's changed the way they're doing their campaign.
Right, exactly. But I mean, the districts don't exist yet. They exist on paper, but no one's actually held the office yet. That will come about soon. Now, as to your second question, Elisa, one of your advisors, has this term called the adapted city, which is there's never, in the old days you had progressive, at-large, nonpartisan city manager type forms of government versus strong mayors, partisan, district level representation, and so you have this dichotomy. Today, most cities split the difference and say, well, we can't just go completely district because then we'll go back to pre-progressive era. You'll have corruption, you'll have lots of bad things going on, no one will have the city's interests at heart. But if you do at large, then certain minorities will be ignored and you will have no neighborhood representation. So they kind of try to, they try to split the difference by having these hybrid systems, which are called adapted cities. And that's the theory behind it, is you will have a not insignificant minority of the council be elected citywide, have the city's interests at heart, and will act as a check on the district level, narrowly focused interests of the district representatives. And so that's the philosophy. Now, how it actually works is unclear at this point, particularly in a city that hasn't even implemented it yet.
Yeah, on the issue of the progressives, I understand your framing of how it worked at the turn of the last century, but there was some good marketing in that. I mean, a lot of that was about wresting political control from immigrant political machines. So the issue isn't which is representative, the issue is who's being represented. And that seems to me to really get to the issue that was kind of slipped in almost in passing at the end about what happens to voter turnout. It seems to me whether power has gone to the powerless, you don't have a clue yet. All you know is what's the potential. You won't know who's got power until we actually have an election. Excuse me. And see whether places that used to have poor voter turnout, which is an awful lot of places, actually get more voter turnout. Because if the turnout remains the same, it's much harder to figure out whether the actual distribution of power is the same. Or you can figure it out, but you have to use a different mechanism to sort it out. And I'm kind of wondering what it is that you would, when you try to think about this issue of what's happening to the neighborhoods, whether you actually went below the theory to look at how council actually was behaving towards neighborhoods. It was certainly the case that, the at-large structure in principle produces citywide interests, but there certainly was a period when council was notorious for just being meticulous about making sure that community development block grants, which can be distributed in a discretionary way, were very broadly spread. And that doesn't suggest ignoring the neighborhoods or being unequal. But that's admittedly just one pot of money. And I'm wondering if you have done any analysis or plan to do any analysis of whether council under this system actually was attending to neighborhoods, so that you can offer that as an empirical argument as opposed to merely a theoretical argument.
Go to your first point. We've already seen some outcomes that suggest that the district, I was referring to the campaign issue, that the dynamics will change a little bit in terms of who has power. So for example, in, I think it was District 7, Southwest Detroit, where you had, it sounds like the beginning of a joke, you had a white Latino and African-American candidate running for office among others, and the white candidate was supported by the good government types, and it basically came down to pure numbers. The African-American and the Latino candidate won.
What was this the election for?
For districts, for the primary.
Ah.
I'm sorry, the primary in
District 6, Southwest.
District 6, right, District 6. And I'm losing track of time, it was some point in the summer, August. So it does indicate that the dynamics are going to shift a little bit, and not necessarily change, but shift a little bit. Now, to your second point, the answer is yes. It would be interesting to see the difference. That would require some comparison, because when you look at cities like where I came from, St. Louis, Chicago, places that are very much district-oriented, they would allocate the block grants and the funds like that in a fashion that was usually based upon a similar criterion that you indicated, which was they'd spread it evenly across all of the districts, but who had the authority to allocate within those districts would be the alderman, okay, the district level representative. Now in the city of Detroit, which we haven't studied this yet, the sort of policy side, which is the next step, it would be, it would suggest that yes, they would spread it out, but who decides where it goes would be very different in districts versus at
Well,
large.
because the whole council would do it.
Exactly. It would be a much different political dynamic, whereas it would be the prerogative of the alderman or the city council member under a district system.
Right, and I think that's interesting, but whichever way that goes, it does, if our hypothesis is right, it does suggest that you can't just broad brush say at large ignores the neighborhoods at the expense of downtown, because it's a more
But comparatively
complicated
speaking,
story.
Detroit has always been a city, compared with cities that had district level representation. It is, whether it's because of at large, whether it's because of the labor management divide, whatever, they have always been, it has always been a city of peak associations of downtowns versus the rest, downtown development, big projects and economic development projects versus neighborhood projects, whereas in other cities it's much more spread out. And that's, comparatively speaking, that's always been the case.
In the geographic representation aspect of the structures of the at-large system, it's still, in the Detroit scenario, it did have there were more people that were from particular areas of the city than from other areas. It was not an even geographic spread of where the council members were coming out of. Even
Right, and I was actually surprised that you didn't point to that when you talked about focus, because there was a good bit of media attention to the fact that council members lived in rather a small number of places that were being directly spoken for. and they weren't needy places by any means.
I remember there was a great deal of discussion and debate over how the lines would be drawn. And if, essentially we have districts that are set up, and I'm not sure how they actually wound up being set up, but it was quite contentious, and you do what you did, you get what you got. I mean, people were concerned that it would disempower those in the minority in the city, as opposed to racial minorities, that it would disempower them rather than empower them.
Yeah, so I tried to address that at least one way in terms of talking about that the current city council members really did put up quite a bit of a fight to prevent that from going onto the ballot. Now, that fight was not very public, because publicly all the members of city council supported the move to district representation. But behind the scenes, they were doing everything that they could to make sure that it wasn't actually going to make it onto the ballot. Now, particular to the issue of how the lines were going to be drawn, that is very contentious. And the ways that that has come up throughout the history of charter reform in this city is rather interesting. In the 70s, because it was much more of a populist kind of mandate, the voters wanted control for the most part of how the districts were going to be drawn. They wanted to increase the size of it, and they wanted to have a lot of agency over how the structure was actually going to be drawn up. In the 90s, again, it was very similar in the sense that they wanted to retain the power to draw the lines. And maybe there were some lessons learned, but in 2008, when it actually did go through, they left that decision up to the Charter Revision Commission. They did not leave that up to the voters, and they did not leave that up to the sitting council. And my idea maybe is that the reason they did that was strategic, so that it would maybe be less of an issue in terms of holding that up, getting voted for.
I was just thinking about this idea of housing segregation, which is still, I think, a real major issue in the city for a long time. And if that has a lot, the link between housing segregation, residential segregation, and voting parts within the city, I mean, who gets represented? There were battles, in the 60s, within neighborhoods, riots over where people could live. The famous wall on 7 Mile, where they divided the city literally by a wall. This must have had an enormous effect on who gets represented in city council, at large district or not. So it seems to me there would be a link between housing segregation and who gets represented.
Certainly there was, and if you look at the 1970s election when it failed, one of my advisors, who has since passed by the name of Robert Salisbury, he has a great article on charter reform, and in the 60s primarily, it was written a very long time ago, but the argument he made is that, his name's Bob Salisbury, the argument he made was that these charter reform proposals are not about good government. They're not about government operating more efficiently. They're about symbolic issues like who controls what, okay? And even who gets what is not as important at the end of the day, because cities are pretty limited in their functionality, but his argument is that they were symbolic. And so when you look at cities that have a significant amount of heterogeneity or diversity within its boundaries, these charter reform proposals take on extreme controversy. They're very important because it is saying who gets to make the decisions. What we were looking at was, well, in a city where that wave has passed because it's become a very homogeneous city, relatively speaking, is it controversial anymore? And the answer was, in the election results, no, it wasn't particularly controversial. And it was 72% voted in favor of it, 3-to-1 margin, but not only within that, at the precinct level across the 500 precincts, there was a very little variation in and levels of support for this. And so it would suggest that in a city of extreme segregation, it's not as controversial as it used to be. Now, if you're looking at, say, a move to metropolitan government, which would include the suburbs, you would see a much more controversial campaign and a much more, much stark difference across the precincts or the electoral units and results.
And speaking to the issue of housing segregation, if you look at the literature of how the different structures are supposed to represent people, if one of the consequences of housing segregation is that you are concentrating your poor and your minorities in specific aspects of the city, that's the result, then an at-large style of representation would not necessarily meet their needs because they are not represented throughout the city at large. So in that sense, a district representation would meet the needs of persons that have been concentrated in specific parts of the city due to housing segregation.
Lucy, a question?
Well, first I would like to compliment on the paper, and I really like your approach of kind of comprehensively looking at the question of the charter change and kind of looking at the external and internal factors. And it seems that here, part of the story that has been happening is basically the support of the diffusion innovations theory. So like Detroit, like other cities of similar size, has gone from more progressive, post-progressive type era reform towards shifting to an adapted cities framework and kind of adapting mixed institutional structures. So the question that I had, I was wondering if there is an institutional story here going on, and what is the relationship between the switch from one form of election to the other form of election and some other structural components of the local government, of the Detroit city government. Specifically, I'm thinking, the form that was adopted, it's a hybrid form with 7 people elected in districts and 2 at large, but it doesn't seem very balanced to me because essentially the 2 people who are elected at large, their function is going to be like breaking the tie. So they're not going to be very significant in terms of the outcomes, and I was wondering whether there is an endogenous story going on at the institutional level. How does this recent reform is coordinated with the other structural changes in Detroit city government? Let's say appointment powers or the shift in mayoral powers or anything like that. Is there anything else going on at the same time that is likely to provide a more balanced institutional arrangement?
I can't answer so technically to that, but there is a lot of literature that looks at those institutional effects, and some of the literature that we're finding now has to deal with structural reform changes that have to do with the aspect of the mayor and the powers of the mayor. We are trending to go into that direction.
Yeah, it's very technical and would make for an extremely boring, mind-numbing presentation, but there was, Proposition D occurred in 2009, and after that there's the charter reform, which is a different thing altogether. And that was that's where when we weren't here at the time, but when the city attorney was basically standing up to the mayor, in subordination to the mayor, and the mayor couldn't do anything about it. That was a reflection of the charter revision package that occurred, and it actually occurred after Proposition D occurred. And so there's a lot of these things going on at the same time, but they're completely different processes, and so it's extremely complicated, but it's a very good point. And you raise a very good point that I think is worth ending on, is being close to 1:30 here, is that when we move forward on this project, we started out, and Adam hinted at this, we were looking to do a pretty straightforward electoral analysis, looking at what were the levels of support within the city for the charter reform, and we expected to see some differences, and we didn't see any differences. You do the map of the precincts, and it's all the same color, because there's very little variation in the support. So we have to kind of go, well, where are we going to go with this next? It's how did it get on the agenda? That question that you raised at the beginning, why 7-2? That probably could be answered by that, because when we start interviewing people and talking to people about how this got on the agenda, the one they ended up with probably was a product of those discussions. I mean, it was a product of those discussions, because they could have picked 1-8, they could have picked 8-1. They could have done a variety of different arrangements, and they chose this one. And my guess is that it was some sort of compromise. The interesting thing about it, though, was that, and I think we've talked to some politicians and other people informally. They know this, that the default in the city of Detroit and in many cities that have similar dynamics in terms of demographics, the default, let me back up, the default in many cities is no. Anytime you get something on the ballot, you have to fight against the no vote. The default in the city of Detroit is now yes. And so if you get something on the ballot, the likelihood of it getting passed is extremely high. And so the debate and the controversy occurs behind the scenes to get it on the agenda in the first place. And that's where we're heading in this project next.
I know you do.
Just wanted to quickly interject, sort of question, just with an invitation. Raymond Mohammed of the Urban Studies and Planning Department is going to be giving a presentation on the end of truth in planning in the coming era of the libertarianistic planner. So I want to invite you to that talk, which is part of the Humanity Center's Fall Symposium on the Truth, which is taking place on Friday. And of course, Raymond and other members of the Department of Urban Studies and Planning are good partners for this kind of conversation. And in fact, we have the chair of that department sitting right there.
I think we've met.
And just quickly, I know you do agenda setting.
I do, yeah, but I don't want to hold everyone up. So a couple of things. I think this structural change is, it's an idea whose time came, but the idea was a long time in the making. So I wonder if you all have looked at what the local media had wrote about the structural change in the 70s and 90s and how they framed the issue, and if that might have influenced the debate. That plus the Kwame Kilpatrick corruption scandal might have softened the policy agenda enough to make this more palatable than it had been, 50 years ago.
Yeah, Adam learned about this thing called the microfiche machine.
Yeah. Oh, man.
And they, in newspapers, you don't just click things into the internet. So you had to go and actually look at newspapers and on the machines in the library. So we did do that. And it is true that it has changed. The media tends to follow, like Adam had mentioned, that whatever works for good government, and the good government is defined by more efficient. And so it's a little bit different now, but they were overwhelmingly in favor of going back to district level representation. And so, but it has changed. Detroit in the 70s, Detroit News was the conservative paper, the Free Press was the liberal paper, and so you saw differences there. But now they're somewhat different papers, but they were unified. So yes, we are looking at that. Then the focusing events, it is important to remember that this thing, the campaign to get it on the ballot occurred well before Kwame Kilpatrick. It got started well before Kwame Kilpatrick had his problems. I mean, the timing, it's never perfect, but this had been going on for a long time. And so, yes, it had an impact, but it probably wasn't the focusing event that you would perhaps think it is. When we look at the ballot outcomes, perhaps that was it, as people were just tired of the corruption and decided to support it.
And in 2009, we were really hard pressed to find anybody that wanted to publicly come out against the Change 2 districts. It was overwhelmingly supported by the good governance groups, by NAACP, by different interest groups. There was not a lot of opposition, at least formally, publicly, to the change in 2009.
By the sitting members of the city council who were going to be basically dislocated out of the job, because publicly it was in poor taste to be against district level representation.
Sure, they might have to move someplace.
Distasteful for them. Yeah, I mean it didn't look good, so. And again, it gets on getting on the agenda. That's where they fought it, was behind the scenes to keep it from getting on the ballot in the first place. But very good point. I mean, that's where we're heading. It's more of a policy type paper. Whatever gets it published.